Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Daniel Clarkson Fisher. Daniel Clarkson Fisher is a Toronto-based writer and educator. He holds a Master of Fine Arts in Documentary Media from Toronto Metropolitan University, where his major research project was the Chinese Jamaican Oral History Project. During his studies, Danny also presented about cjohp.org as a work in progress at the 6th Emerging Scholars Symposium on Oral History, Digital Storytelling, and Creative Practice at Concordia University's Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. So let's have a listen.
Dis Affamie History, and to talk about your project, your oral history project of the Chinese Jamaican in Canada. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. So my name is Danny Fisher. I sort of write and publish under my full name, Daniel Clarkson Fisher. I am a librarian in Markham, Ontario. I have an academic background teaching in a couple of different areas. The last one before librarianship was documentary media. I did a Master of Fine Arts program where I created this project, the Chinese Jamaican Oral History Project, as my MFA thesis.
Oh, thank you so much. And I know I said this before we started recording. I really love the project. In terms of how you did and how you compiled all that information. And obviously it definitely comes off as a love project as well. So what was your inspiration for creation of the Chinese Jamaican Oral History Project?
Well, you nailed it. Love. As at the risk of sounding like a hopeless romantic, my partner Stephanie is Chinese Jamaican, and I'm fascinated in all things Stephanie, and one of her great loves is the community. And you and I were talking before we recorded a bit about genealogy and also sort of wanting to know more about her roots, how far back she can sort of know things about her family. And so I just sort of became involved in sort of exploring with her, talking with her. And there was a call, there's sort of an unofficial kind of email channel within the community for different sorts of projects and things. And the late Ray Chan, who was a photographer, took many beautiful images of Jamaica that get, sort of used in books and tourist materials and things. He wanted to call people together to talk about trying to do like a popular oral history project. I know from reading scholarship by people like Anne-Marie Leloy that there had been some sort of, I think, academic-led efforts to record elders in the community at some point in time. I'm not sure what happened to those recordings, but I think he wanted to do something more public-facing, more, kind of for the people. So he kind of assembled a lot of key players in the community, and I met a lot of really interesting people who ended up being interview subjects at that meeting. And it was to sort of talk about the direction that we wanted to go. And Jeanette Kong, the documentary filmmaker, the great documentary filmmaker, and Steph had both kind of pointed out projects that existed online. Things like they're not perfectly analogous, but projects like Humans of New York and things like that had this sort of, fun kind of spirit, this really kind of creative energy in how it presented the work. And they were sort of thinking something like that. I think there was another contingent in the group that thought, let's just make a book, something that we can sort of put out to the community. And then Ray became ill and eventually passed away. So the project kind of, after a lot of early conversations, sort of just stopped. And when I got into the program, I had sort of considered doing something to maybe contribute to it, like a genealogical project. I kind of felt, being a white settler, I didn't want to sort of overstep my bounds in terms of doing things for the community. So I thought, well, why don't I just limit myself to Steph, her parents, her aunt, a few kind of people who I feel close to. And I have to give her credit. One of my professors, Herda Kamer, just very gently, when we were talking about it at one point, said, you should ask. It sounds like you know some interesting people, and I don't think you want to do any harm to the community. She said, it's very good that you're thoughtful about this, but maybe just see. And so when I raised it with people, there was a lot of energy about like, yes, just get it started. We just need to get something down, like rather than a blank sheet of paper, but then that created, questions as well of if I was going to get something started that was greater than genealogical, wanting to be careful in issues of representation, who's being covered in this sort of initial batch of interviews. It's not a final group by any stretch of the imagination, but it does feel like a kind of, when I was putting it together, it felt like this will be a batch of interviews that will tell people a lot about maybe the parameters of the project and where it could go. So that it was, I think a good thing to get the push to think outside of a family only project, but at the same time, it came with a lot of questions and concerns, but relatively happy with where we ended up. So, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Because that is, yes, being mindful, but as well to be able to preserve that information. And I'm glad that you were able to have so much collaboration and so much buy-in as well to know that there was not going to be any harm to be done to be able to do this. So, what were some of the methods that you used to collect? And you mentioned probably some of them in terms of the interviews and preserve the histories of the project.
Well, I think one thing that I was sort of interested in, for better or for worse, I suppose, was trying to understand, in creating an inventory of like questions that I was going to ask everybody, to have a kind of relatively common set of questions with some differences depending on age, experience, all of that. Because I thought it would be worthwhile to sort of hear different voices on different issues. But I think one of the delightful discoveries of it, was finding, having a very broad question like, can you talk about what being Chinese Jamaican means to you? For some people, that phrase doesn't mean very much at all. I think of myself as Jamaican. I think of myself as just Canadian. Other people, I think, really engaged with it in interesting ways. But, I think the utility of the project emerged as I was doing the interviews to sort of see like, this is a really interesting community that thinks about things differently and maybe resists categorization sometimes. And it doesn't always kind of neatly attempts to sort of kind of frame everybody, get very tricky very quickly. So on the one hand, it was good. I look at the inventory now, and some of the questions seem kind of quaint and funny, having learned what I've learned. But I don't think I would do it differently, because I think those things needed to come out in some ways. And I think for anyone who would sit and listen to all the interviews, I think they would come away with like, this is really interesting how the community does and doesn't think about itself when they're sort of confronted with these questions. And so I think I deviated from your original question, though. You were asking about the methods, and I was that was a method. I really wanted to have a set of questions first, although it changed very quickly. Steph was the first person I interviewed, just because for myself, getting started was important. So, being able to have one recording gave me kind of gas in the engine to kind of keep moving. but then the inventory changed significantly, especially after I had a really helpful conversation with Jenna Ten-Yuk when I interviewed her, about things she was curious about and that she would want to ask. And she was an early interview, so I was able to sort of rework it a little bit after talking to Jenna. So I give her a lot of credit for that conversation, where I at one point I would open it up and say, are there things I haven't asked you that feel helpful? And Jenna just had a lot to say there, and things that she was curious to ask me about the people I'd talked to, and what are you finding here? Have people kind of talked about this? And so it was funny. Steph was the first interview and she was the last, because by the time we got to the end, it was so different from the set of questions I'd asked her. I was like, I'm so sorry. Can I do this again with the new questions? Yeah. And I basically did pretty simple recording. I used a microphone kind of not unlike the one you have there. And I didn't want to have everybody come to the same place. I didn't want to be sort of burdened with technology in a way that it made it difficult, or that I had to have people come to the same location or something like that. So I tried to pare it down so that it was good equipment for capturing the voice, but I sacrificed a certain kind of audio perfection for just being able to be movable. And as it happened, I did interviews in university offices, living rooms. I interviewed Suzanne Kong at her parents' house. We were supposed to get together somewhere else, and she said, well, I'm at my parents', but if you want to come here. We just went to like her old her childhood bedroom and just sort of sat and did it there. So it was all, I'm really glad I did it that way, and then it didn't become a kind of thing where I took over like one of the studios at the university and was like, everybody's got to come here because we've got so much equipment. And I think that made it relaxed for some people too. I think it took the nervousness away for some to be able to do it in their homes. And then I stored the interviews on the Internet Archive. So if you go there and just search Chinese Jamaican oral history, you'll find all of them there. I used WordPress to create a site to sort of house the project at cjohp.org. And then I used tools from the Northwestern University's Knight Center to do things like the timeline for context and stuff like that. So, and then beyond that, I mean, I read a lot about oral history and oral history theory. So that was informing kind of a lot of how I was thinking about my role as the narrator, especially with issues of difference, and a lot of the, this being, whether I intended it to be or not, a kind of cross-cultural interview situation, where I'm interviewing as someone who really doesn't know much about the experiences that I'm asking about, and trying to kind of be thoughtful, careful, mindful, those sorts of things. So sorry, this was a long answer, but yeah.
No, that's fine. That's fine, because I mean, it's very robust, and we might want to think that it's one thing, but it ends up being, multiple layers, right? So to get to the information that we need, and to be able to store it as well. So as I said, great that you're able to do that. And again, just to see how the final product came out was, as I said, just fabulous. And what would you, how do you think that this project contribute to, I guess, the broader understanding of Chinese diaspora communities in the Caribbean?
Well, one of the things Steph was invaluable in sort of talking about things early on. And I think one of the things I remember she asked me was, do you want to cast a wider net, like, kind of the Chinese in the Caribbean broadly? And, we had friends and acquaintances who, were from elsewhere in the kind of Chinese diaspora. And it felt to me that there were differences that might be very fine, but were distinct enough that it felt like I can sort of drill down and know a little bit about this particular experience, or I can sort of do a kind of clumsy job of trying to know a lot about an entire region. So I think that's maybe if I feel like I contributed something with that, maybe it was that. Like it's worth doing the particular work rather than doing the kind of general work. And I mean, I came away like with many questions, seeing enormous complexity just within this very specific community that I sort of identified for the project. That's enough. I mean, I sort of feel like I would have given myself complications that were bigger than an MFA project timeline can hold if I had sort of said, I'm going to include the Chinese in Cuba and the Chinese in Trinidad and, just everywhere. It wouldn't, it would have been very messy. And I don't think you would have seen things like the timeline or you would have seen a much more general timeline that I think, you and I had talked about the timeline and that being something that I really enjoyed putting together and you very kindly, expressed enthusiasm about. That I think one of its qualities is a kind of degree of specificity, and I don't think it would have that specificity if I was trying to capture everything in a very, general way, because I've got, 3 narrators who are from Trinidad and 3 narrators who are from Jamaica and 3 who are from Cuba. So, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does make a challenge in terms of the broad scope, but definitely, as I said, very well done. And, going on to the next question, like how have Chinese Jamaicans maintained their cultural traditions, having, being integrated into Jamaican society?
I think, one interview that maybe sheds a lot of light on this is Patrick Lee's, his father being a very kind of significant figure in kind of maintaining that connection and sort of helping kind of keep the community together culturally. So you would see things, I think, like community centers that would recognize holidays like Chinese New Year. The newspapers seemed really important. That's something when I came to the end of the project, I would like, if I had, another stretch, like a semester to work on this, I would want to spend more time learning about those, the newspapers that were trying to sort of be a bridge that way to kind of let people know what's happening back home. Mm-hmm. And also sort of communicate to them in a way that was significant for them as people living in the Caribbean and not there. And then, you really interestingly have these magazines that speak to the experience of people in Jamaica, like Pagoda. So this magazine, comes along and it's for the Chinese community in Jamaica, but it's more focused on issues of the island. So less of the what's happening back home and more of what does our community look like here? What are people excited about? So you have this, there's this preservation, kind of work happening, but then there's also this work of just trying to understand the unique experience there. So that's really interesting. And then you also had the community sending young men home to China for big parts of their adolescence to sort of learn the language, get to know family back home. My father-in-law talks about it a bit in his interview, Eustace Lynn. His timing was quite odd. He went right before the Cultural Revolution. So he was sent home early because of that, and didn't learn Chinese because he wasn't there long enough. So I'm going to forget exactly the stretch of time he was there, but the kind of getting settled and then that happening and the sort of not knowing what to do just equaled him not getting that kind of educational experience. And, it's something I think he's a little self-conscious about, even though, I don't know how he could have helped that, experience that, wasn't something that happened to him by choice, that it just happened. I mentioned Jeanette Kong, the documentary filmmaker, and she made all of Jeanette's films are wonderful and sort of essential resources. And she's also a wonderful interview. I can put you two together if you'd like to talk to her sometime. She made a short film called Half about, I believe he's a distant relation of hers, a sort of older Chinese Jamaican gentleman who kind of sheds light on that experience. So he has a lot of photos, he has a lot of things to draw on. so the short is really about what that experience would have looked like for those young men. So you had a lot of these sort of formal and informal methods for sort of keeping roots strong from certain places.
No, and that's what's needed in terms of being able to keep the connection back to, I guess, motherland, so to speak, so that they know their history and they know their identity as well. So,
yeah.
The other thing is, I guess, some of the challenges that face in collecting. I know that you mentioned it in a previous answer of these oral histories from the Chinese Jamaican community.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can think of an interesting thing that happened when I was sort of developing the project was I got incredibly lucky. Richard Fung, the Chinese Trinidadian filmmaker who teaches at the Ontario College of Art and Design, was one of our guest artists, and he came in to sort of do a lecture, talk about his work. And then with our guest artists in the program, they would sort of look at one project and give feedback on it. And so very quickly, I think the faculty thought that should be Danny's project because he's doing something about the community. And one of the things Richard said to me was, at that point, I had some of the sort of notable elders in the community. I had done a bunch of interviews with them. So Carol Williams Wong, Keith Lowe, Patrick Lee. And Richard said, I know a lot of these folks, and I think they're sort of great ambassadors for the community. But there's a tendency, I think, sometimes for those to be the kind of voices that people lean on a lot. And so a kind of challenge in the project will be elevating common voices more and kind of not making it feel like it's the sort of inadvertently, the kind of elite voices that always sort of populate these, sort of dips into understanding a community. And so I had people lined up who I didn't feel like were sort of the usual ambassadors that way, but it made me a bit more thoughtful about what that would look like, when it came to the final project. So in a couple of cases, just trying to convince people who thought I don't have anything to offer. It's like, well, I think you're an interesting person to talk to. And that's why, and I think, that too was just a kind of, a lovely modesty in the community, even from people like Steph, who I know she's my wife and I love her. That is a great interview because I think she has little observations and pearls of wisdom about the community that I've never quite seen articulated anywhere else. And Anne-Marie Leloy, her interview is the same way, but in a different way because she's a scholar. So she has these sort of very thoughtful kind of composed takes on things. But Steph, is sort of more shooting from the hip, but is just sort of very eloquent in articulating what she sees. And so even her, she's like, you can just talk to my dad. He went to China. It's more interesting. And I was like, no, I really want to get you. And there were people who turned me down. I mean, who were just too shy about the whole thing. They're very supportive of the project, but they just were kind of bashful about it, or just sort of felt it was unbecoming of them to participate. So that was definitely a big struggle. And there are some interviews that I really wish I had that, they give me a very polite but firm, I just can't do it.
Yeah.
So, and then I think, this is a more subtle thing. One of my other professors, Brett Story, who's a wonderful filmmaker, this was already something I was, sort of worried about, but just sort of her kind of articulating, being careful about not kind of painting a picture that looked too much like it's playing into the model minority kind of story as I'm sort of doing the connecting the dots to Canada piece. And it's very tricky when you're doing a documentary project and you're trying to convince people of the usefulness of what you're doing. You end up sort of saying it's a really important community. You've got to look at this community because here's why. But then sometimes that can, again, inadvertently brush up against these sort of problematic tropes and things like that. So trying to be careful about noting people's interesting work and achievements, but not sending a message of like weird exceptionalism or this sort of thing. So those were all the sort of major challenges to me. I mean, the things that I thought were going to be hard, like the technical qualities, the building things out, that ended up being a cinch. It was more, I feel like the challenges for me were more theoretical and practical when it came to the relationship building and the who am I asking, why am I asking, what can wait, what can't wait, that kind of thing. And what would I be worried to release this out to the world without having, and how do I take care of those things?
No, absolutely. And when you were talking, it just brought back memories of when I would, go and interview people and they would say, well, Wendy, you can talk to somebody else. They're way more important and they have better stories than I do, type of thing. So, and not realizing that, everybody's story is important, and just to hear their perspective is a fabulous thing. So, and it's just funny that it kind of relates, in the different groups. So, and I guess this goes to, what role did, I guess, memory and storytelling play in shaping the historical records of this community?
Well, I think, that's the things that I presented the project, and if I had it to do over, I would probably do this differently. There was sort of an installation where I took selections from each interview and just sort of played them in a loop so that people could come into a room and experience sort of the voices and see the pictures that I took of the narrators. I think it worked fine, but when I presented the project, as I mentioned, at a conference at Concordia University for oral historians, and seeing how they present work, was brilliant. And like in some cases, like an opening for a project might be a computer lab where you have headphones, you have other and people can sort of take the time and experience the websites that are created for these things. And that's my one regret, that you could sort of go into the installation and think, I did it right. And you don't get to read anything on the website, see the timeline, see any of the resources that the narrators gave me. Because in some cases, they gave me things which are scanned and on the website. So I almost wish I had sort of, I think I drank the Kool-Aid of the kind of MFA art thing. And I was thinking installation, but I should have thought something more like a reception that encourages experiencing the site in a certain way. But the pieces that I took out for the installation were all, I would say, they're really striking examples of memory or storytelling in them. So, like, for example, Patrick Lee and Carol Williams Wong have these really vivid memories of being children in Jamaica, and Patrick talking about like Chinese New Year, Carol talking about her family's shop that they ran and how they would show movies, like against the wall. Brian Chang talked a lot about coming out as gay in the Chinese Jamaican community, and his experience with his mom, and it just the way he tells the story, you can you get a character of his mom in your head. He's so good at telling the story. I've not met his mother, but I feel like I have a great mental picture of her from that. Tony Wong also was awesome. He was formerly the television critic at the Toronto Star, and he talked about coming here alone as a child, and basically that being the beginning of a kind of a love affair with television, that it was sort of like, wow, there's so much, and he gets very interested in televisual storytelling, and because I think he was lonely and scared, and so that was really touching to me, that he made that connection with his life. Like, I have this great love of and career in sort of television writing, television criticism, and that comes from this childhood experience. And so that's everything. Kind of, I mean, there's a lot of good informational material in these interviews, but every single one of them, I mean, was an effortlessly wonderful storyteller. So it was really something. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It allows people to, what I find is to relive a period of time in their lives, that whether good or bad, but it allows them to relive that. And then of course the emotions of that experience comes through as well. So which only enhances the storytelling.
And another one I just wanted to mention that was interesting to me. My mother-in-law, Joan Lynn, talked about coming from Jamaica to Canada. And that was so interesting because, I mean, I think that's one that seemed like a difficult area for people to articulate, the sort of migration from Jamaica to Canada, and why, the timing, to the degree that it had to do with the Manley government or other things going on. And, people were kind of elusive in talking about that sometimes. So what was so interesting to me was that she had so many memories of that journey. And so the clip that I used of her in the installation, she talked about like crying the whole time, like on the plane. And so it was really that, I mean, I remember I sort of sat forward in my chair when she did that, because it felt like just something that people were kind of brushing a little past in a lot of interviews, and I think sometimes because there's pain, like they didn't necessarily want to leave, or they have questions about leaving in hindsight, or, but that she just went right to it and was, it's like, oh yeah, I cried the whole time. I was worried. And, that was something that stood out for her. And that she had a lot to say about, was one of those memories that I felt was really valuable, just because they were so hard to find sometimes.
Absolutely. Because again, it gives the truer indication of what really, what was impacted on their lives as to what happened, and what the outside events impacted on them. And I guess, in this, I guess maybe kind of leads into the next question in terms of, the impact of the project had on the preservation of Chinese Jamaican history and heritage. Like, what would be, I guess, your thoughts on that?
Well, you and I were talking a bit about the digital humanities. And I mean, I think this is something people like Anne-Marie Leloy have been looking towards as well. How do we sort of organize and collect some of this information in the online space in a way that's kind of helpful and can grow? And so I like to think that, I mean, that was something that in those early conversations in the group that Ray talked about, that there was definitely strong passion about, from people like Jeanette and Steph, sort of saying, books are great, but we need to think about this as well. And just, kind of go through that door and not be so scared of that as a possibility, that we know what we're doing when it comes to making books and, sort of publications and conferences, but are we as comfortable in the area of digital preservation and digital projects? And so I'm going to be, modest in responding to this, because honestly, I don't know what the effect is. But I mean, I do feel like if I've done anything, it's trying to sort of move these efforts that way a little bit. And I tried to build it so that I can literally hand the keys to someone else as well, so that it's not something that's, it's enormously complicated and it's trapped. And if somebody with a bunch of enthusiasm wants to come in and take it the next way, it's easy to sort of transfer ownership, leadership, management of it. And I like that too. I mean, I feel like that's a contribution, that it's not a locked thing. It's a thing that can evolve, change, continue, completely renovate. I like that about it too. That it's not a Yeah, it's not. I'm struggling for a word here. Locked. I guess I keep.
Yeah, it's not something that's going to be like, stuck or stagnant, or it's
Yeah,
going to be, the main and the only type of thing.
exactly. Yeah, and I think I just tend to be a little wary of resources like that, and interested in all the kind of voices and experiences that are kind of left out sometimes. So, meeting people like Jenna Tenyuk and Brian Chang, I was struck by the sort of way queer voices can feel kind of outside of the mainstream in storytelling here. So, I mean, I think trying to kind of leave things open so that if there are other experiences where people similarly feel like, I don't know that we get captured when people talk about, this experience, that's there. So I feel like I would be in horror if I created something that became a kind of locked resource that way. So really building something where it's like, okay, that's not there. We can fix that very quickly, very easily. And it doesn't detract from everything else, that what's there is there, but then it can have more as well.
No, absolutely. And it definitely can inspire other groups as well to say what what you have done. Is that something that they can be able to do as well? So, I mean, it has a multi-factor impressions is what I would have to say. But I know you kind of alluded to this in some of the other questions, but what were some of your favorite memories in working on this project?
I think like just the sort of unexpectedly beautiful kind of moments that happened, and they were moments that I couldn't have created if I wanted to. So, when I was interviewing Kay Moosey, who is Steph's aunt, we were talking, and I can't remember what was one of the questions in the inventory, but I think involvement with like community groups, organizations, and she just was like, not really. And her daughter was in the next room listening and came in and said, "Mom, what are you talking about? Like the Chinese Caribbean Association was started in your basement." And I think sure enough, if you go to their website, it mentions that. And she was just like, "Oh yeah," and then that interview got sort of interactive in a way that the others didn't. Kay started asking me questions at one point. I don't know if it was the sort of Jamaican modesty, you're asking me too many questions now. I need to ask you some. But at one point, she just sort of stops and says, "How are you finding the community? How are you feeling like you're fitting in? And what's interesting to you?" And I on the one hand was wanting to wrest it back to her, but she was just so earnest in asking me that I'll kind of never forget that moment, that she just was in a very genuine way. Tell me about what you think. And it was lovely. And then I alluded to talking to Keith, and one of the questions on the inventory was asking people to tell me a little bit about their immediate family. And a lot of that came from, kind of the relationship between genealogy and oral history. It's like, help us connect the dots so that if someone who doesn't know these people is looking at it, they can say, "Oh, okay, this person is that person's father," or, this sort of thing. And so I asked Keith, I said, please tell me about your family. And he gave this beautiful answer, which is his clip in the installation, about how I'm related to everyone who's a low. And he talks about going home and meeting ancestors of his family. And his father had always very religiously sent money home growing up. And they were so appreciative of that they kind of knew everything about Keith. And in his letters, he told them about his family and all of that. So they knew everything about Keith. They knew everything about his sisters. And it just sort of was and Keith got very emotional telling me this story. And clearly it was sort of a mind-blowing thing to him. And he felt this kinship and family with anyone with the name Lowe after that. And so it was interesting. He avoided the question, and I don't have that in his interview, anything about his immediate family, because he said, "I am related to everyone who's a Lowe." And it made me emotional, like when he was telling me, because it's such a beautiful story of kind of not knowing this side of his father, and then feeling this great connection and responsibility to people he's meeting for the first time, and then feeling like I need to pay that forward to everybody who kind of shares the name. And I mean, that whole interview with Keith was just great. I mean, I feel like we were both very much in sync. So there were a few times where it was like he'd forget the name of something, and I was right on top of it. And it was, for some reason, that one just felt like a dance. Like we were kind of very in tune, Keith and I. And, talking to my in-laws was interesting. I mean, it was a different way to talk to them. So my in-laws, Joan Lynn and Eustace Lynn, are both narrators, and I had heard stories, some of them before and some of them not. And so just getting to know them that way was interesting.
No, stories are impactful. They're very impactful, and gives you a picture. And then, it's just another way of connecting. And I know that you mentioned in terms of, some of the associations that were involved with this project. And how did the affiliation of these associations really help to assist to bring the project to?
If you go to the website CJOHP, you're going to see a lot of stuff about the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and I was very lucky to get a SSHRC grant to work on the project, which meant that I didn't have to work for the second year of my program. So I was able to sort of just go to classes, and then rather than like TA or have another job, I could just focus on the project. As someone just part of the working world now, that time is really invaluable, and it meant a lot of things could happen kind of fast, or by comparison fast. And that I could do things like, we were talking about the timeline, like take like just a week and just be working really intensely on it, because I had all the notes. And so it's just plugging things in, sort of, shining it up so that it looked nice. And, I'm really grateful for that, because I think a lot of the things that I like about the project would have been harder to pull off in the time frame otherwise. The Sun Sin Association, which is one of the sort of Chinese Jamaican associations based in Scarborough, I owe them a lot too, because that's where I met a lot of these people. My in-laws, Joan and Eustace, are both very kind of involved with things over there. A lot of the photos were taken there. There's a photo of Joan that's sort of the cover of the website where she's playing mahjong, and that's at their center. And then they just, I was sort of always welcome to sort of float around with my camera or, the recording equipment. And, I just, the sort of openness there was, I really appreciate how great they were that way. Although I should add, they weren't involved in an official capacity. It was just sort of like, yeah, we know Danny, he can run around and take pictures, see what he's doing. That's fun. But yeah, SSHRC was the sort of the major one for help there.
No, that's great. And I guess if we can just kind of just do a visual, or do you have any area you want to share just to see what that timeline looking like? I know we've talked about it the entire time.
Yeah.
Just a visual.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, this is the timeline, which, as I said, it's just quite detailed, but really, really great, because I mean, this really gives a really good time frame period. Because if we click on things, so let's go back to the first one here. So this is around early 1800s.
So the Night Lab creates these tools for creating all sorts of things, timelines, tools for websites, and they're completely free to use. You just need a Google account to sort of populate it with images and all of that. But as we were saying, I wish I could take more credit for this, but a lot of this comes from the work that Keith Lowe, Lorraine and Patrick Lee, Aaron Changbor, Anne-Marie Leloy, and other people have kind of done. And I I was just sort of furiously taking notes on everything I was reading and collecting images. And Keith and Lorraine and Patrick, what they had done was just sort of bulleted, like a timeline. It didn't include everything. There were things where I thought, oh, I might have included this, or I might have put that in, or this seems interesting, or this seems useful. So then originally I was just going to do a page on the website, which might be bulleted and have a couple of pictures in it. But I'd known about the Knight Labs tools for a long time and was very interested in them. And I just sort of had a bout of courage at the end of kind of putting things together, where I thought, I can find some time to do this, so let me try. And so put a lot of it in, but the backbone of it is really this work that Keith and Lorraine and Patrick and Anne Marie and Aaron Changbor did.
No, and this is, as I said, as I told you before, this is just absolutely fabulous to be able to have it put in a kind of like a picture format. Again, people think, I guess, with for oral history, to say that, this is documentation. It can be presented in a different light. Something like how you have here on the timeline, which is absolutely fantastic to be able to see for people who are visual, as well, to have that and to just show that it can be an interactive model as well. And with those tools from Northwest University as well, to be able to use it, since it's an open source.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fabulous, because people who might want to think, I have to pay, tons of money to be able to do something like this, where it can be achievable. It's going to be the learning curve, but otherwise, this is definitely something that is just, as I told you before, just fantastic.
Oh, thank you. And I mentioned Steph is this is her favorite part of the whole project. And one of my another memory I really love was when we showed this to my father-in-law, and he was, he just sort of sat quietly and was going through it, and it was very moving just to see him pleased with it, seeing images that made him think of things and share memories. And it just, it's kind of one of those moments that makes you feel like this is why this is really good work, the oral history work and all of that, that he, seeing his engagement with what got created made me happy.
No, absolutely. And then just to timeline everything and how this all encompasses, because again, with the Chinese coming to Jamaica, I mean, this was in different waves in terms of when they came and how they came. Some came as indentured, some did not come as indentured. So it's just making sure that's all lumped all into one as to type of how they came to Jamaica. And then of course, emigrating, some to emigrating to Canada and elsewhere. So it's just having that all documented. It's just very, very well done. So, and I guess as we close out this particular episode, is what would you say to anyone else that is doing this type of oral history? Whether it's as a family historian, whether it's as a scholar researcher, what would you say should be, I guess, something that they should be able to look out for, something that they should be aware of, and what can you give as advice for them as well?
I talked a little bit about refining the list of questions, and I think what I started with felt to me open-ended. But I think the shortcoming of some of it originally was it reflected maybe too much. Even though I didn't feel like it did, there was too much specificity and expectation that the person might see things this way, so I'm going to ask it this way, and then discovering some people don't even think of themselves as, quote unquote Chinese Jamaican. So that immediately those questions get sort of, kind of run into a brick wall or, things like that. So I think, trying as much as possible to keep things open-ended, so you're not sort of directing people one direction. And it's, I think, difficult to give very specific advice about how you do that as such. But I mean, because in my case, what I had on paper and I had shared with people didn't strike anyone as too specific, but it felt too specific in practice doing it. So it got to a place where I was trying to really just ask questions that gave them a runway. And if they were going to say something unexpected, they had room to do that. And they weren't feeling like, oh, I'm not answering it the way he asked or with an assumption in mind that he's asking. And I think even with your family, one of the interviews that illuminated this maybe most sharply for me was my father-in-law, was Eustace. So, I think he kind of brushed up against some of those questions a little bit, and was kind of challenged some assumptions, even when the assumptions weren't that strong. So, so all the more the case when it comes to family and not just, anybody you might be interviewing, because they might be the most surprising in some ways in that regard. And I think being open to those alleys and avenues that you're not expecting, and being prepared, but not prepared to the degree that you're unable to sort of attend to those, kind of things, those curveballs, those things you're not expecting. And it sounds funny. I would just say enjoy it too, because, in talking with you about this, I'm reminded of all these interviews and how much I enjoyed myself, and how memorable some of those experiences were. I didn't even mention when I was interviewing Carol Williams-Wong, our interview was quite long. I think that's the longest one. And her husband got hungry at one point. We were in her kitchen and he came in to try to quietly make some toast, and she felt he was too loud and kept like swatting him. So if you're listening carefully in the interview, you're hearing something and it's her being like, no, go, we're not done. But it tickled me enormously. And, and Carol's just a ball of fire to begin with. So, I felt a lot of joy in those interviews, even when some of them had their, moments that were sad or, not always very, very happy. Just the experience of being with people and kind of, I don't think there was anyone who, even if there was the interview brought up difficult things, I don't think there was anyone who was like, I wish I hadn't done this, or that they enjoyed themselves, and it brought us, tightened our relationship in some ways. And, so, yeah.
Oh, no, that's great because, as you said before, it just, it creates a safe space for people to be able to talk and to know that somebody else wants to hear what they want to say, whether they realize it or not, that it's almost like a faucet. Once you turn it on, it starts flowing. It really starts flowing. And because I know when I met with my cousin, my distant cousin, he was 97 years old, and to be able to have that conversation with him, and to just to start the conversation and just see how things flowed. It was just it was a bit I was taken aback by it because I wasn't expecting something like that, but it was just to know that he just felt open to be able to discuss and to say anything, and then to kind of take me back to that timeline as to what that place was, what it was, what it looked like, and just when when he says things like, when do you remember the time? I'm thinking, I don't think I can remember the time, but you don't, but you gave them, you give people a space for them to be able to talk, discuss, open about things that they probably would have never opened about with people that they are, that they live with and that they know, type of thing, as opposed to yourself. You really wanted to know. And I think that's the power of, with this oral history, that it can be able to do for people, just providing you a space to be able to discuss.
And I think being ready for that too. I mean, that may sound intimidating to some people. I mean, it really is, was a pleasure on my end, but I think it can be unexpected. And I would say, like, the interviews that I thought would be emotional weren't, and the interviews that I thought would be emotional, or the interviews that I thought would be emotional weren't, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So, that can be kind of unexpected and put you in a kind of a funny place. But yeah, I mean, again, if you come prepared, if you come earnestly listening, if you come knowing these things might happen, like you really might open the floodgates, and it's a very pleasurable experience. But yeah, and I mean, there's good resources out there about oral history, and I would read them. I waded through a lot of material about photography, filmmaking, other things like that in my program, but obviously I was meant for oral history, but those resources just felt so useful to, like, I felt like I felt really attached to sort of some of them because they were so helpful in a way that, like, a lot of resources about other kinds of artwork just felt, helpful, but not like that helpful. And these really felt like, oh my gosh, I totally know what that means, and I needed a word for that, or like, oh, that's so smart to sort of say, if you're going to deal with this kind of experience, do it this. So there's just so much good stuff about oral history out there, and definitely use it. If I think you'll find it's a pleasure to read, on top of being helpful.
Definitely, and I'll put those in the show notes as well, some of the stuff that you've mentioned, so people can to access that, because that's really the core for genealogy, to be able to interview and to be able to talk to people and to be able to discuss things. And these are things that do come up, whether known or unknown, in terms of what can, emotions can be brought up during this time. But I do want to thank you so much, Daniel, for coming on to the podcast and to be speaking. I think we could continue for another couple of hours.
Well, it would be a pleasure on my end.
But no, thank you. I really do appreciate your time, your project that you've done, and as said, it's been a labor of love for you to be able to do that and to put that out there, because it really is. It is great. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your work. I've become a fan of the podcast since you reached out. So I'm looking forward to becoming a longtime listener.
So perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.